Hi. Let me preface this presentation with information. I'm not a trained philosopher. My research interest primarily surrounds how media, specifically comic books and superheroes, are represented and what meanings they hold. However, over lunch, when Kyle was wearing this uniform, he begged me to do a presentation on this particular episode because he said, watch the Orville. I watched it and I was disgusted with the message. So, the episode of the television show, The Orville, named Cupid's Dagger, raises serious questions about sexual assault and philosophy. Questions of what constitutes knowledge and consent are at the forefront of the episode. The focus of this presentation will be these questions. I will begin with a quick synopsis of the episode. As has been said, Captain Ed Mercer and Commanding Officer Kelly Grayson are former romantic partners. They meet an archaeologist named Aurelio who arrives on board the Orville to help resolve a planetary dispute between two warring factions, the Navarians and the Berudians. Mercer blames Aurelio, who had an affair with Grayson, for breaking up their relationship. A recently discovered artifact containing residual DNA was discovered on the planet. Both sides agree that the DNA will prove rightful control of Lipovius. Aurelio wants to respect the boundaries of Grayson and Mercer, and the trio agree that he may stay. On his way to his quarters, Aurelio bumps into Lieutenant Yaphet, the blob. In sickbay, then Yaphet tries to woo Dr. Claire Finn with flowers and a song, but she angrily rejects him. Grayson meets Aurelio in Science Lab 1 to discuss personal boundaries, but she starts flirting with him after several minutes. After Grayson misses her meeting with the warring factions, Mercer goes to her quarters to tell her that the ambassadors have arrived, only to find her having sex with Aurelio once again. Mercer storms into the science lab to fire Aurelio. Mercer's attitude, though, softens, and he begins to forgive Aurelio, and they agree to have a romantic date later. Later, Dr. Finn, wearing a cocktail dress, rings Yaphet's quarters and he invites her in. The two kiss, and Yaphet asks if she wants to go for a swim. A frustrated and suspicious Catan talks to Aurelio demanding answers. He explains that his species releases a pheromone when in heat that can cause powerful sexual attraction behavior. Grayson and Mercer absorbed the pheromones when they first shook hands with him. Claire absorbed them from Yaphet, who passively carried them after bumping into Aurelio. It goes on. There's maybe a war that's going to happen because the two commanding officers are not doing their duty. To resolve this, Aurelio suggests that his pheromone be modified and be given to the warring ambassadors, make them fall in love. It happens. A peace breaks out. Peace and love. All right. At the very end of the story, Grayson asked Aurelio if he was in heat when she slept with him. And Ed is there. Aurelio pauses and then answers, maybe. The first question I asked after watching this episode was, Kyle, are you nuts? Or, wait, wouldn't Aurelio's actions constitute sexual assault? Aren't they letting him off the hook too easily? And wouldn't that make what they did to stop the war wrong? The answer to these questions would seem to turn on whether Ed, Kelly, and others involved would be said to be giving consent. As it pertains to sexual assault, Planned Parenthood defines consent as the key term in defining sexual assault. Without consent, sexual activity is sexual assault or rape. In order for sexual activity to be freely given, it must include the following characteristics: be freely given and be informed. As easy as we'd like it to be, however, the question of what constitutes consent is perplexing and difficult. Liberto isolates the voluntary nature of consent in the article Intentions and Sexual Consent. She asks, can we give consent without intending to give consent? Philosophers have recently argued no. Consent involves the waiving of a right or at least the releasing of another person from a duty that he or she would otherwise have. If I hoodwink another person into rendering consent, we typically do not consider that person to have rendered morally valid consent. I would have suggested that consent is voluntary, and the voluntary nature of consent requires that consent to be intentional. And and she further argues that misinformation or lack of information undermines morally valid consent. The difficulty in all fields dealing with this question is highlighted by Gerber, who says, consent is a philosophical, psychological, and legal quagmire. Nevertheless, it bears mentioning that philosophically, premising morality on consent implicates complicated theories of free will and determinism. Indeed, here's the problem as I see it. If consent is voluntary, as Libretto argues, then it is freely given. Essentially, consent is freely given assent. But if that's true, then consent may be impossible to give. Why? Well, most philosophers don't believe that we have free will in what is known as the libertarian sense, in the sense that I can do otherwise. When it comes to whether I choose to do X or not to choose to do X, both options are not equally possible. What decisions I have made is determined by my brain structure, but in reality, only one decision could have been reached, the decision that my brain is configured to reach. Worse still, we can't even say that brain structure could have been otherwise because of the other choices that I have made, because ultimately my brain structure is determined by factors that ultimately are outside my control, basically DNA and environment. But the libertarian notion is what most people have in mind when they believe that they have free will. It certainly seems Libretto has the libertarian notion of free will in mind when she says that consent is voluntary. But if consent is assent freely given in a libertarian sense, and libertarian free will does not exist, then it's possible for anyone to give consent. Every sexual act by anyone of any gender at any time would be sexual assault. To solve this problem, we might do what many philosophers have done, embrace compatibilism. And compatibilism is the notion that free will and determinism are compatible. It can be true that we have free will, even if it is true that the world is deterministic. So even if decision I have made by my brain structure is outside my control. One way of defending this notion is to reject the libertarian notion of free will and embrace another. Frankfurt, for example, argues that a decision is free as long as it is made in accordance with one's sexual second-order desires. Okay. If this definition of free will is right, then we can have free will. If we can have free will, we can voluntarily give assent. If we can voluntarily give assent, then we can consent to sexual activity. So on the compatibilist notion of free will, Libretto's definition of consent does not make consent impossible. And that's good. The problem is if we go with the compatibilist understanding of free will and Libretto's definition of consent, what happened to Ed and Kelly don't constitute sexual assault, when clearly they did. Why? Well, consider what the pheromone does to Kelly. At first, it just seems to create a first-order desire in her, like the addict's desire for a drug. There's a scene where Officer Catan says, okay, so what exactly happened? Grayson says, I don't know. I went to the lab to tell him that there was nothing between us anymore. But then I looked into his eyes, and I just forgot how gorgeous he is. Catan, gorgeous? Really? Grayson, those aqua blue eyes against that deep blue skin? Ridiculous. He has this magnetism. And then the next thing I knew, we're back in my quarters. Catan, wow. Grayson, it's hard to explain. It's like a drug. But Drulio, it's just this super intense sexual desire. And this rush every time I see him. He's all I can think about. But then we see that's more than just that. The pheromone has changed Kelly at a fundamental level, changing even as the kind of person she wants to be. She no longer has her second-order desires about being a good officer or even a good person. She just wants to be with Drulio. Catan says, he's all you can think about, so much so that you forgot about the delegates. Grayson, oh, it's fine. It all worked out. Drulio's the one. He's my soulmate. This is also true of Ed, who skirts all his responsibilities as captain and doesn't even care that he neglected his duties so much that he's about to be responsible for a war between the Navarians and Bruvians. Indeed, the pheromone has seemed to change his sexual orientation. The pheromone not only creates desire, but alters a person's second-order desire by changing the kind of person they are. At one point, Catan tries to play down the effect of the pheromone, but Drulio pushes back and explains what it does. Drulio says, I didn't mean for it to affect Ed and Kelly, but it probably happened when we shook hands in the shuttle bay. Catan, And now they're both in artificial, crippling love with you. Derulio. Oh, there's nothing artificial about it. They're experiencing feelings. Chemically induced feelings, I grant you, but feelings nevertheless. One might argue, of course, that because feelings are chemically induced, that consent hasn't been given. But a chemically induced feeling is ultimately what love is, even in normal circumstances. So this fact is inconsequential. Think of it this way. The definition from Planned Parenthood makes it clear that consent cannot happen under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Alcohol and drugs lower inhibitions towards certain behaviors, but those behaviors are still in the person. A person under the influence seems to lack the ability to consent. The pheromone that Derulio transmits acts differently, however, because it doesn't reduce an inhibition against desire, but it seems to completely replace a pre-existing second-order desire. So, for example, hating Derulio is something Ed does at his very core of his being. Derulio is responsible for the breakup, but Ed forgives Derulio, and he wants to be with him at the expense of everything else. It had changed Ed down to the very core of his being, and this is also true of Kelly. If that's true, if that is what Derulio's pheromone does to a person, then on a Frankfurtian compatibilist understanding of free will, those acting under the influence of Derulio's pheromone are acting freely and thus giving consent. Thus, what Derulio has done doesn't constitute sexual assault. But clearly it does. Indeed, I would say that most people would say that Ed and Kelly are not freely choosing to do what they are doing, even though they are acting in accordance with their second-order wants and desires. Thus, it seems that the compatibilist notion of free will is flawed, cannot say the notion that consent is freely given. Is someone timing me?
You're fine.
Okay. In short, here's the pickle that we are in. We usually think that consent is freely given assent, but since it seems that free will doesn't exist, it would be impossible for consent to ever be given. We could get out of this problem by embracing a compatibilist definition of free will, like Frankfurt's, but that would force us to say things like what happened to Ed and Kelly do not constitute sexual assault, when they clearly do. Either way you slice it, there is a problem with conceiving of consent as voluntary assent. The solution, perhaps, is reconceiving what consent means. And we can use the episode to perhaps reveal how we might reconceive it. Consider what happens at the end of the episode. Ed and Kelly asked Derulio whether he was in heat. The implication is here, if he was, Kelly wasn't really to blame for her actions because she was under the influence of the pheromone. Derulio says maybe, gaslighting them. But it seems that if he had said yes, this would have changed everything. Knowing this would change their evaluation of her activities. And in the same way, if Ed and Kelly had known about the pheromone during the episode, they likely would have had removed consent. With this in mind, we might suggest something along this line. Sexual consent is given when one assents to an activity, but there is no salient information that one could learn that would make one renounce consent that the other party could reasonably expect to have revealed. This allows for consent to be given, but also makes it clear that what happened to Ed and Kelly does constitute sexual assault. I would argue this definition, while not solving all the problems of consent, does provide a better path for adjudicating genuine consent. So how would this manifest itself? Well, let's first look at Derulio's action. He does not inform anyone of his condition until the very end of the episode. This is salient information that have changed the behaviors of people involved. It is reasonable to say that one should be informed about the exposure to a powerful chemical agent. Had he provided salient information about his being in heat when he first boarded the Orville, he could have informed the commanding officers and chief medical officer. Appropriate action could have been taken to ensure valid consent by all parties. Simply requiring Derulio to wear gloves as a protection against unintended transmission of the pheromone would seem to be reasonable. And this is basically analogy of, if you promise to wear a condom as protection against sexually transmitted disease in pregnancy, it's really relevant. Tom Doherty lays out two criteria for determining if this information is salient. In this claim, I stipulate first, deception must concern the sexual encounter. So you have to deceive whether with information or lack of information. For example, this would include deception about whether the person is using birth control. Second, the deception must concern a deal breaker, a feature of the sexual encounter to which the other person's will is opposed. This requires more than concealing an undesirable feature. Derulio's action certainly violates both of these standards with regard to Ed and Kelly. First, deception is concerning the sexual encounter, i.e. the knowledge of transmission of the pheromone acts to induce sexual behavior. The second standard is also violated. Both Ed and Kelly make it clear that they don't want to initially engage in sex with Derulio, thus clearly communicating that sex with Derulio is against their will. The situation with Yaphet and Dr. Finn would not be a morally unacceptable instance of denying consent. Yaphet is not being deceptive because he's unaware that he's had this pheromone transmitted to him. So when, okay, cool. When Yaphet touches Dr. Finn in the medical bay, he does not do so intentionally transmit the pheromone, but rather as a normal part of his interactions with the doctor. His transmission of the pheromone is unknowing and in his mind not concerning sexual encounter. Other behaviors he engages in during that scene would be considered concerning the sexual encounter, such as his singing the romantic song and delivery of flowers, because these actions were intentional and with the knowledge of the potentiality that they may lead to sex. But those would not be relevant for our concerns here. Other examples from the show could be evaluated from a standard to determine whether or not consent has been freely given. For example, what they do at the end of the episode to end the war is especially problematic. If they had at least had a conversation about weighing the positive consequence of ending the war with morally problematic nature of forcing two people who hate each other to fall in love, have sex, and then get married, that would be one thing. But instead, they essentially weaponized the pheromone to resolve the ongoing war, without any thought to the morally questionable nature of the activity. While my friend Kyle here does make a strong case for viewing the Orville as great science fiction with salient social commentary and sound moral messages, he's just wrong.
We got a little more than 10 minutes for discussion with Kyle and Mike.
Great.
Sure.
Yeah, well, I have a question about deal breakers. So if I understand this argument correctly, for there to be consent, there can't be any information, salient information, that's withheld that would be a deal breaker if it was not, right?
Yeah.
And if that salient information is withheld, then it is sexual assault.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess, different people have different deal breakers. So, for instance, maybe somebody I know had a relationship with, and unbeknownst to him, she was seeing somebody else, right? And that would have been a deal breaker had he known.
Yes.
But that information was withheld from him. So is that sexual assault? Was this person sexually assaulted?
I think yes, I would.
Really?
And I would, the argument, oftentimes when we try to draw lines about what is consent and not consent, we try to do a very black and white line. This clearly is, if you do X behavior, and if we do this, it isn't. I kind of conceive of it as more as a continuum, and that can be problematic in its own regard. But for me, given that it is salient, relevant information, perhaps the person that was wanting to engage and didn't know about the other person, that person should have said, this is kind of a deal breaker for me, that, I want to be in an exclusive relationship, not, dating around. Now, in the pragmatic reality of the world that we live in, how do you ask all those salient, relevant things? Well, we should be better communicators. We should maybe not hop into bed with, the first person that we see, if we do have these sorts of deal breakers. So, again, like I argued in the paper, this doesn't solve all the questions of consent and sexual assault, but I think it's at least a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and part of it is like you could be reasonably expected to know that it's a deal breaker and that you should reveal it, right? So I think in your case, in this case that you have described, I think it's the person should know it's reasonably expected to reveal that kind of information, right? In other situations, right, like if you don't know whether or not how religious you are matters to the other person, and you don't tell them how religious you are, well, maybe that doesn't count, because you didn't know, right?
Or if you're a Trump voter.
Right, maybe if you didn't know that that was a deal breaker for them, then that,
Should know
I
that.
should know that.
Yeah, maybe it would. Jason?
So continuing kind of on this point, because this is the wider, metaphysics of intentionality and so on, what someone intend to do and other things, again, what information is required. That's all theoretical precondition for defining consent and so on. So one of the questions that comes up in this, can one intentionally basically consent to a future action under conditions that might not fit the definition of consent? So here's what I'm thinking of. If I go to a bar, or someone goes to a bar, it doesn't be me, someone goes to a bar with the intention to get intoxicated and the intention to hook up with whoever, at the time that they actually hook up with someone, they, by the Planned Parenthood definition you gave, they're under the influence of alcohol, they're not in a position, but they had said, I'm going to go get drunk and hook up. Is that sexual assault?
I would probably claim not.
Okay.
Now, there's certainly maybe a diminished capacity that it might make it more likely and such, but particularly if there's forethought of, I'm going to get loaded and I'm going to get laid. That to me, you're kind of just saying, I'm going to consent to basically whatever happens under those particular circumstances. So I think context makes a big difference. So if you are, it would be, if you're going to a bar, yeah, that probably would mean that you consent. If you're going to church, that probably, it's a hard question, but I do think that the intentionality of, I'm in the mindset of, I just want to go have physical relations, means that you consent to it.
So just to clarify that, in the context of Derilio, now that they know about his pheromones, any time that someone who knows how puts themselves into physical proximity with him and touches him should know what they're getting into.
Yeah, once they know, then, yeah.
Okay.
Right,
gotta
and
take steps.
given that this only happens like once a year, it seems to me that, that's a reasonable sort of thing to,
And you should always be asking, anytime you come, are we safe, or you need to ask Derilio, right, and he needs to tell you.
I guess it's unclear, I'm gonna defend Julio here, because, you keep saying, so obviously sexual assault. I guess it wasn't obvious to me
Okay.
that it was sexual assault.
And it's not obvious to Seth either, that's why the episode's like this, please go.
Because, one thing you're pointing out is that when they're under the influence of these pheromones, all the, other desires become bracketed. So who's to say that even if I'm informed, in the state of being under the influence of the pheromones, I'm going to consent to things. Now I'm informed, but I would still consent because I'm under the influence of the pheromones. So it seems like the knowledge doesn't help me at all if it's as powerful as it seems to be. And then the problem there is, this is a feature of his species being. It's not like he's doing it intentionally to anyone. And if the information isn't going to change the outcome, then why is this just a requirement on him? And so I guess I'm just wondering, do we outlaw it? Whenever he's in heat, he just can't have sexual relationships because no one can actually consent. And then that seems like a problem based on his species, which then we get into really problematic territory because we're saying, you've got to wear gloves, you've got to expose to everyone that you're in heat all the time, and you can't have sex while you're in heat. Then it seems like we're getting into a different type of oppressive territory based on his body.
Yeah, well, he's, it wouldn't necessarily be the case that he could never have sex while in heat, because if he informed everyone, if somebody was like, I'm fine with that, then they could.
But the point is, if the pheromones are that strong, then they're going to say they're fine with it, even if they're not.
Well, they would have to do it before they're exposed to the pheromones. They would have to consent before they're exposed to the pheromones. But then if they did that, then you could have that condition, right? And then, but there is this other issue of there's a kind of cultural moral relativism issue here, because he actually, at one point in the episode, says, hey, in my culture, it's rude to turn down an offer of sex, right? If I said, hey, I want to have sex with you, and you said no, I'd be offended, right? And so, there is this there is that cultural relativism issue that comes up here, obviously, right? But it's kind of an intuition pump to just say, look at what happened here. He is knowingly hiding the fact that he changes the very nature of people to make them want to sleep with him when they otherwise wouldn't want to. And that looks like, it's like super roofies, right? Like, and that seems morally
But
problematic.
is he knowingly hiding it, or is he just not under pressure to
He is
disclose it
hiding it.
because that's just his person, that's who he is?
And the episode doesn't really talk about that, so like, if we knew about the Grulio species, is it, have been medical studies that say they go into heat and this transmission happens, and so is this commonly known knowledge? It doesn't seem so, because particularly given Grayson's attitude that she had the affair with him earlier and she was unaware of that he might have been in heat, it seems that this is pretty closely guarded information, and there might be reasons to guard that information, such as you don't want to weaponize the pheromone like with what happened at the end of the episode. So, there might be good reasons for that, but particularly given his state, I think that even if he was, instead of shaking hands, if he had just simply thought to himself, I'll wear a glove, make sure that this doesn't happen, it could be problematic, and I have a job to do.
Right. And it should be made clear also that when Alara confronts him about it, like what is going on, he literally says, all right, you got me. Right, and then he tells what's going on, right? So clearly it was something he knew was going on, and he was intentionally hiding it. And he says, yeah, what's the worst thing that happened? A bunch of people have a bunch of great sex. What's like, it'll wear off, right? Not seeming to appreciate that, even if it is good sex, if it's not consenting sex, that's a problem. But
Yeah. And I also have problems with it as a solution, because if it indeed wears off, it could make the conflict even worse, because it's like, we had this
these guys
agreement, and
in
you
2 days.
screwed me over because you put me under the influence, it was your fault, and so we're gonna, no more, we're gonna just fight it out.
Well, just what you said actually is sort of disturbing. Because, I think the other examples that you said, the parallels and the situations are kind of a little heavy-handed. I haven't seen the show, so I don't.
They're definitely heavy-handed.
But
One of the
this,
reasons I love it.
just like you said, even if it is good sex, it wasn't consenting sex. I think that goes to the heart of the Me Too movement, like that men tend to think of sex, whether it's good, like was it really fun, whereas women, was the consenting part. The statement that you just had, like, maybe brings up a lot of the subtleties and things that we say and do that we think are fine, whereas other people might find that, like, not fine. Also, so is the end, the little ambassadors, is that assault?
Is that what?
Is it assault when the ambassadors make?
Yeah, that's the problem,
It's
right?
just
Like,
totally assault, even though it happened, even though something good and they actually didn't have sex, or did they have sex?
yeah, apparently they do, right? Like they're gonna get married. They have sex, they fall in love, they get married, and
They
this
get
ends the
married,
whole.
oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're gonna meet their families, and one gets very gushy about it, it's like, oh, you're gonna take me to your family.
So the pheromone could have propelled them to that, but it couldn't have made them do that.
Well,
Could it?
It does. That's,
It
that's
does.
the sci-fi premise of the show is that it does do that. It changes who you are down to the core and makes you do that. That's why, it changes Ed's sexual preference, right? He was heterosexual, now he's homosexual. That's the kind of effect it has.
Maybe he's just bisexual.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I guess that's a possible interpretation, right? But the inclination before this is that he is heterosexual. But I guess you could change him to a bisexual or something like that. But that's the kind of point, is it just changes you down to your core, right? And I think that if I understand it right, like we agree, like this is very morally
I'm just
problematic.
saying, like you just said that maybe it was good sex, but it was not consenting. I think that good sex has to be consenting. How can-
Oh, right. So I've got a different definition of good there, right? Like,
Right. I just wanted to point that out.
yeah. And really, actually, that dichotomy, like that could only happen, like in the real world, you couldn't have good sex that wasn't consenting, right? Only when you can like literally change someone down to their core.
You could have two people having completely different interpretations.
Oh, that's true, that's true. So I meant for a particular person.
Well,
It would not-
couldn't you have like a reevaluation of the sex? So, for instance, on Better Call Saul, Jimmy McGill gets women to go to bed with him by convincing her that he's Kevin Costner.
Oh,
Right?
Right.
And so she has great sex, thinking
And then-
that it's Kevin Costner, but then presumably might later learn that it wasn't, and then, and then the experience becomes.
Yeah, and that could happen for both Ed and Kelly here. They could reevaluate it once they realize that, oh, I wasn't giving consent, even though it seemed to me at the time that I was, or whatever.
We're out of time for Mike and Kyle. Let's get a round of applause. And